Welcome to Podcast on the Brink, your weekly dose of Indiana basketball news and discussion, brought to you by the Assembly Call and Inside the Hall. I'm your host, Jerod Morris. Join me live at assemblycall.com every Thursday night and immediately following every IU game for our live IU postgame show. And visit InsideTheHall.com for complete coverage of IU basketball and to join the discussion in the Inside the Hall Premium Forum. On this week's edition of Podcast on the Brink, Alex Bozich and I are joined by our old friend Matt Dollinger, former host of Podcast on the Brink, Matt Dollinger. Matt, now an assistant managing editor at SI, as well as the editor of The Crossover, so really focused on the NBA, and that's why every offseason we bring Matt on to kind of go around the IU players in the NBA, get an update on kind of how their careers are going. We'll, of course, talk about the injury rehab for Victor Oladipo, and then we'll look at the current Hoosiers, most notably Romeo Langford and Juwan Morgan, and what their potential NBA draft prospects look like. All of that coming on this week's edition of Podcast on the Brink. Before we get to that, a word real quick from our sponsor, SeatGeek. You know, with college basketball season over now, how are you going to spend the offseason? What sporting events are you going to go to? There's baseball games. Obviously, football is going to be starting up before we know it. Summer is concert season, so there's going to be lots of concerts. And if you ever need tickets for any of that or anything else, make sure that you check out our sponsor, SeatGeek, because for a long time, buying tickets has been really difficult and annoying with a few big companies who don't really care about the customer. At least that's kind of what their actions suggest. But SeatGeek is a ticket company where the customer comes first. With more than 50,000 five-star reviews in the App Store, SeatGeek is focused on making your experience as easy as possible. SeatGeek pulls in millions of tickets from all over the web, rates each deal on a scale of 1 to 10, and displays them on an interactive seat map so it's simple to find what you're looking for. Green dots are good deals, red dots are overpriced. Very, very easy. See at a glance which are the good deals, which are the bad deals, and every purchase is fully guaranteed so you can shop for tickets with confidence. I have the SeatGeek app on my phone. It's by far the easiest way that I have found to shop for tickets. My wife and I will definitely be going to some concerts this summer, and we will be using SeatGeek to get those tickets. We're also going to be getting my father-in-law. Well, I don't think he listens to this podcast, so I think I can say this, but I think we're going to try, he's a big Packers fan, we're going to try and get him tickets here in Dallas when the Packers play the Cowboys this year. He'll definitely be using SeatGeek for that, too. Listeners to Podcast on the Brink get $10 off of your first SeatGeek purchase. SeatGeek supports our show, so we hope that you will support them as well. Use our promo code BRINK for $10 off your first purchase. You can use that for concert tickets, sports, comedy, whatever you want. Remember, that's promo code BRINK for $10 off your first purchase. And now, here's our conversation with Matt Dollinger. All right, and we are here with Matt Dollinger. Matt, welcome back to Podcast on the Brink. It kind of feels like this has become an annual tradition here, having you on in the offseason to look at Indiana from the NBA perspective.
Well, it's very much appreciated. Thanks for having me. I love to stay in the loop with everything Hoosiers, and anytime my new life in the NBA can provide a little context, more than happy to contribute.
I guess before, we hop in and look at, kind of the prospects for Romeo and Juwan, and then, talk about some of the guys currently in the NBA, what were your impressions of the Hoosiers this season? Obviously a disappointing season, but what were your takeaways?
I thought I was strangely committed to this team for all the ups and downs it had. I watched, more games than I have in recent years. I felt like I knew the roster a little better. And for one reason or another, this team had something that you just couldn't quit. Like no matter how many just terrible losses there were, either games they blew or games they were never in, for some reason you kept tuning in because you realized that this team actually had a pretty high ceiling. And if everything went right, they are pretty good. It just didn't really happen. And they would just give you just enough to keep tuning in. It's like, in golf, like birding the 18th hole, just so you come back the next time. So I am in the camp of giving Archie Miller some more time, and I'm not trying to burn anything down just yet, but it definitely was a disappointing season when you just take into factor all the talent that was on the team.
Yeah. So, speaking of all the talent that was on the team, we've seen now a lot of guys declaring for the NBA draft. Obviously, Romeo was expected. We're going to get to him in a second. Juwan, of course, graduated. And so, now he's ready to, to get drafted or sign somewhere as a free agent if he doesn't. But I think people were surprised to see the names of Devontae Green, Justin Smith, and Al Durham show up in terms of declaring. Now, because guys can declare and come back to school, and now guys can even declare and sign with an agent and still come back to school, it really, there really isn't a downside to these guys doing it. And so I think it needs to be made clear that that is the case. What I'm curious about is what actually happens now for guys like that, who probably aren't going to get drafted. I think most people assume they're going to get feedback and come back. What is the actual process for them getting feedback, and what NBA teams are investing time in giving feedback to guys that really probably aren't legitimate prospects right now? How does that all work?
It's really changed, and it is for the better, but you're right. It's jarring at first. I mean, when you see Justin Smith declaring for the NBA, Bozich knows I sent him some angry G chats throughout the season about Justin Smith in particular. At first you're taken aback, but it would be silly not to take advantage of this process now, the way they've adapted the rules. I think the Hoosiers in the last 7 or 8 years were in a good position with Tom Crean, because Tom was one of the more connected college coaches in the NBA, and he knew coaches, he knew scouts, he knew writers, GMs. He, best friends with Woj, which is pretty much the best connection you can have. He was able to get a lot of good feedback for his players and probably tell them if they were ready, if they should go, if they shouldn't. But most college coaches are not that connected, and Archie Miller would definitely be, in that group. It's not a slight; it's just a fact. But now they've changed the process where it's kind of taken away some of that competitive advantage, where it's out in the open now, and that's the way so many things in college basketball should be. You should be able, if you're a junior in college, you should be able to find out, could I get hired right now, or should I go back for my senior year? I mean, there are plenty of people in other industries that do that thing. And now they've got that, in the NBA, you can find out from teams. You can get the intel on where you are. You can have conversations with these people. You can have an agent, set up the infrastructure to kind of survey the league. And now I think, if more than anything, it's just going to tell you the honest truth about your game. Maybe Archie tells you one thing, but the reality is the NBA is going to tell you what it's going to take for you to make it or not. So a guy like Justin Smith, has incredible raw talent. He could be a real player. We know some of his shortcomings, just from watching him, but to hear from an NBA team is going to be different, and it's going to mean more to him probably too. So I love it. It takes some adjusting, because at first you are taken aback to see these guys declare for the end. What? No way. But then once you think about it, it does make sense.
So, and then how does that feedback work? Like, will Al, Devontae, or Justin, will they send a form to each team and then hope to get something back from each team? Is there kind of like a committee of people who advises? What's the actual process?
It's definitely more of conversations, I think, than paperwork. But it's conversations you're permitted to have now because you've jumped through the right hoops. And an agent's going to, for especially a guy like Justin Smith, who isn't really on the NBA radar, but hopes to be one day, he is going to scour the league, talking to every front office person he can about Justin Smith, showing him highlights or trying to get him. I'm not sure if they're allowed to work out in front of the teams or not, but it just opens the floodgates, and things that used to have to be a secret, or you had to go through a liaison of a liaison. Now you can find out matter of fact.
Matt, let's get to the one guy who of these four actually has a chance to be drafted, Romeo Langford. I've followed multiple mock drafts throughout the season, big boards, and Jeremy Wu, who's writing for The Crossover, which you're the editor of. Insert a plug here. Go check that site out. But he's been lower than most this season on Romeo, and I think in his latest big board that came out, he's got him 20th, which if at the beginning of the season you told me he was going to be that low, I would be shocked. What in your mind has maybe made his stock fall, and is it something he can get back at this point?
It is weird to see a guy like his pedigree, be dropped like that so far. And it really is a huge fall from 5 to 20. But I really think this season, really many times he did a disservice to himself, whether it was the decisions he made or the way he played. It probably is a great case to get rid of the one and done rule, because if there hadn't been a season at IU, Romeo would have been a top 5 pick. And, this is why guys don't come back for a second season when they maybe need a little more seasoning is because the more they get exposed, the worse their stock is hurt. And I'm not saying, Romeo won't be a good NBA player one day, but what are you basing it off right now? I mean, he had a season where he was set up for success. He got to play with Juwan Morgan, a NBA-like big. He got to have a supporting cast, some guys who could create their own shot. It wasn't like, everyone he was going to get triple teamed out there every night or something. This should have been a big year for him. He was in a good position, and he just didn't deliver. And, we talk about his shooting a lot. It doesn't seem like he's got a bad shot. He just couldn't make it. I don't know if it's confidence issues or if it is a slight adjustment, but I don't think that's going to be a long-term problem for him. But if you can't shoot at the college level, no one's going to say you're going to be a shooter in the NBA. You're going to have to prove it. And that is by far the number one commodity right now. If we talked about every guy from IU in the NBA right now, the basic story is, did he learn how to shoot? Because if he did, he's doing well. And if he didn't, he's probably on the fringes. And with Romeo, he has a lot of good traits to be a good role player in the NBA. He's a good defender. He is a good rebounder. He's long. He can guard multiple positions. He can really finish at the hoop, which is, I think, the thing I was most impressed with him is his ability to draw contact and finish at the rim. But if he can't shoot three-pointers, he's not going to make sense as the fourth or fifth best player on the floor. That kind of guy has to space the floor in the NBA, and that'll probably make or break his career. And Jeremy Wu, our draft analyst, is pretty hard on him, but I can't say he's wrong. And for Romeo, if he becomes a three-point shooter, if he can shoot 38% from deep, he's got a career. But if it's around 30 or if it's lower and he's not a three-point shooter, I don't know why you play him out there. He kind of reminds me of a guy who's on the Kings now, played for the Jazz a long time, Alec Burks, who's a good player and has been in the NBA for a while, but no one's ever thought of him as a foundational piece because he can't shoot threes. And there's a litany of guys with Romeo's, pedigree and kind of prototype that make it or don't because they can't shoot three-pointers. And, it seems almost silly to simplify it that much, but that's what his career is going to come down to.
I know he had surgery recently to, I guess, correct something on his hand that was bothering him. How much will that factor in NBA teams looking at the season saying, the information he gave to Jonathan Cavoni was that he was hurt before the Duke game and it was something he kind of battled through all season. Will an NBA team look at that as, a reason that the shooting fell off, or are they going to want to see, like in a workout, him actually make shots at a high level? Because it's interesting, once you get past, I think, the first 3 or 4 spots in this draft, it seems pretty wide open.
Yeah.
And it's also hard to imagine if Romeo can go into a workout and actually shoot the ball with confidence and make shots, him actually falling all the way down to 20.
I actually think he's going to do very well at workouts too. I think he is a guy that's going to look great in those things, and he's going to do the drills well, and he measures well, and all those things. I think the pre-draft run-up will be good for him, and I actually do think his stock will bounce back a bit. And you're right, it is a weaker draft after those first couple guys, and there are teams that would love to talk themselves into Romeo Langford. Shooting guard is one of the weakest positions in the NBA right now. There's a lot of teams that could use a good wing that could also handle the ball, that could guard 3 positions. That's a position of need. And there just needs to be one team that talks themselves into Romeo. And, I don't know what to say about the wrist. I don't want to say anything out of line here, but, I had no idea he had a wrist problem all season. It felt a little convenient with the timing when it came out. I'm not going to lie. But I hope that was the issue. I would love for him to have played through a wrist injury to try and help the Hoosiers, and that affected his shooting. That would make everybody feel good. So, I think they'll evaluate the wrist, but I don't think that's going to make or break where he gets picked. And, it's one of those things where, how much did, the NIT ending, that didn't sit well with me. I don't know what the general consensus is in the IU landscape, but if his wrist was really bothering him to the point where he can't play, I understand that. That makes a lot of sense. But if it was a tough call and maybe you decided to just err on the side of caution, I think that was a mistake. I really think he needed 1 or 2 strong performances to end on to get back into being considered a consensus lottery pick. And it seems like a good opportunity to do it. So I don't know.
And I think, Alex, the NIT thing was more the back, right? That was more the stated reason why he sat those games out.
That's what they said in terms of what happened at the Big Ten tournament, the Ohio State game. Gotcha. I know he left the game at one point, went back to the locker room, but then came back and continued to play. Yeah. I kind of looked at it as from the standpoint of, if he was banged up a little bit, you probably don't risk it playing in the NIT, which is a secondary tournament. But, Matt also makes some good points. It's like, if he would have taken the team on a run there and had a couple of big games, maybe that changes the narrative at least a little bit.
Totally. Yeah. I mean, you see football guys sit out bowl games, and that's pretty accepted at this point. And I think the NIT should probably be treated like a bowl game, not a lesser bowl game too. So that argument does make sense, unless you need bounce back performances to help your stock, which was the rare case with Romeo. It's not like I felt like he could preserve his stock and just be good. So that was an interesting decision.
Let's talk a little bit about Juwan Morgan. What do you think the chances are at this point that he gets drafted? And perhaps more importantly than that, what kind of team, what kind of system do you think he needs to end up with to have a chance?
I think if it was a different era, and not a drastically different era, Juwan Morgan would make sense in the NBA and he would get picked. And I just worry that his height is going to be such a hill to overcome. He's not going to be able to, because there are things that Juwan does that make up for his height really well. He's a great rebounder. He gets how to box out and position himself with shots, going up. He's in the right spot. He's great at finishing down low. He's got so many different moves. He's really crafty. And he can step out, and play face up too, which most big men can't do. But where the way the NBA is trending, where there's one big on the floor and a bunch of guys that space the floor, we know he can't be that big. You'd be too undersized like that. So could he be that fringe player that's kind of a half big, half wing? That's what he's going to have to do. And I think to go that way, he's actually going to have to become more of a ball handler and more of a confident three-point shooter. And some of the stuff he does well under the hoop, I'm not sure that's what NBA teams are going to want from him. It's ultimately going to be icing on the cake, I think. So I don't know. I'd love to see a guy like him make the NBA, because I know how good of an impact he'd probably be on the rest of the roster, and how hard he's going to work. And there are some skills that translate, but I kind of think of him as Jordan Hulls a little bit. And Jordy's had a great career overseas so far in Europe, and I think he's having a good time. I think he's being fulfilled basketball wise. Would he love to be in the NBA? Absolutely. But I see Juwan having a successful pro career one way or the other. And maybe he does get a crack at it. Like DJ White got a few chances in the NBA. He was a little bit bigger, but DJ got his fair share of looks, I think. And maybe he won't. Maybe he will be a summer league guy, and that's the only look he's going to get. But I do think that he's done enough to be on the radar at least. And, he might not get drafted, but he could be in summer league. He could be at mini camp. He could be that kind of guy. And you never know. I was talking to Bozich the other day where I wonder if IU fans feel similarly, but I've been wrong several times now about guys who I thought were one thing at IU that turned out to be something else in the NBA. And we'll get to that in a little bit, but like a guy like Thomas Bryant, when he left IU, you're going to tell me that he was going to be in 2 years a critical part of a team and a starter. I would have thought you were crazy. So it's been a surprise.
Okay, so let's stay right there, because that's a good segue into what I wanted to talk about next, which is some of these guys that are currently in the NBA. And let's go with Thomas, who obviously was traded from the Lakers, and then had kind of one of those vintage Thomas Bryant games where he went like 13 of 13 or 14 for 14 or whatever it was. And you see some of the things, the excitement, the enthusiasm. Is it as simple as Thomas's 3-point shooting progressed, and that allowed him to kind of stay on the floor, and the rest of the pieces that we saw at Indiana were there, or were there other things that he's really improved upon that have allowed him to stick?
I think he's improved a lot. The guy who I saw at IU was sometimes tentative, didn't have the best hand-eye coordination, which is a weird thing to say about a basketball player, but it's true. And he was just a little clumsy. And that's gone away in the NBA, at least to the point with the Wizards. And maybe it's a matter of getting reps. Maybe it was a matter of playing with the Lakers, getting those G League reps, playing in practice, and now being at the Wizards. It might just be a matter of fact that he hadn't played enough basketball to really find his groove. And this year he started 53 games, He got a ton of run this year. The Wizards were decimated by injuries. They don't have a lot of bigs that are young. Jeff Green, Dwight Howard, Jan Mahimi, those guys are just eating up minutes. They have Bobby Portis, who's probably Thomas Bryant's biggest competition there for minutes. But there's nothing wrong backing him up or complimenting him too. So I think the Wizards, they might want to keep him around. I don't know if they're sold on Jabari Parker, who they traded for midseason. Bobby Portis is a guy who I like in particular, but I'm not sure if they're going to want to pay him what he's going to cost. And Thomas Bryant might come on a reasonable deal where, this guy's 21 years old. He could easily have been in the draft this year. He just averaged 10-6 for you. He showed a ton of energy, which the Wizards desperately need. He has enthusiasm when he plays basketball too, which another thing the Wizards desperately lack. And he showed he can hit the three. I think he shot like 33% from deep. If he can do that, honestly, that is enough to keep teams honest out there. So I like I said earlier, I was a guy who, when Bryant left the Hoosiers, I thought it made sense because his draft stock was high enough, but I wasn't sure he was going to translate as an NBA player. And, he's taken a mini Oladipo leap this past year in terms of getting better.
It's one thing to have this kind of season, put up some numbers on a team that, is barely trying to win. And that's clearly what the Wizards were. What do you see now as Thomas's long-term potential, and what is his role on a good team? Because obviously he's not a starter on like a playoff team, but what could he be?
But he could be, like I said, I don't think Bryant's bigger than Juwan Morgan, obviously, but I don't think anyone's going to project him as a center, really. I think he'll mostly be a four, but with his athleticism and, the way he's active under the hoop, if he can stretch the floor and shoot from three and kind of keep teams honest there, he's good enough to play 30 minutes a night, I think. And on the Wizards are a different team, honestly. And he's still so young. It's crazy to think that in 5 or 6 years, this guy could be entering his prime. What could he do then? Will that athleticism still be there? If so, I'm going to bet he's a better shooter. I think I wrote down he was 6th in the NBA in field goal percentage this year. That's something. So I would love to be Thomas Bryant's agent right now. I think it's going to be a good summer for that guy.
Matt, I want to talk about two other guys who are fringe NBA players at this point. Well, maybe not fringe in the case of Noah Vonleh, but Yogi Ferrell definitely kind of fits into that spot now, considering the year he had in Sacramento. With we talked the other day offline about it not being a particularly strong free agent market this summer. What do you feel like, Noah Vonleh is what kind of attention will he draw on the market? And also Yogi Ferrell, my understanding is he's got a $3 million contract with Sacramento for next season, but it's basically if they opt out of it, the team does by July 4th, he's basically cut loose. So actually, right. Sacramento is going to have the advantage of seeing what's available on the market before making a decision on Yogi, which is not a great spot for Yogi to be in. So I'm just kind of curious what the market is in your eyes for both of those guys going into next season.
Well, I think Yogi, it's probably in his best interest and Sacramento's best interest, I'd say, to keep him around for another year. The Kings are a mess. Let's just call it like it is. It's not a stable franchise. They should have fired their coach. But Dave Yeager clearly fell in love with Yogi. He played him 70 games this year. De'Aaron Fox is the future in the franchise there. But if Yogi could find a role backing him up, that's a good one. And, he was battling Frank Mason from Kansas for minutes this year. But I think he ultimately won that battle and was getting more playing time than him down the stretch. So, with Yogi, he's never going to be a starter, but he really could be a valuable backup, especially for a team that needs like a change of pace type of guy. And Yogi has enough offense to contribute, but it's his defense that's ultimately probably going to get him the sticks somewhere. I mean, can he be lightning quick? Can he just hound ball handlers? Can he put pressure on there? Can he give a guy like Fox a breather while, not letting their team drop off too much? So I think Yogi's going to be a guy who's going to probably play 15 minutes most of his career if he's successful. I would use a guy like Patty Mills as an example for who Yogi should try and be. I mean, Patty Mills is a good player off the bench. He can hit threes. He plays exceptional defense. He gets the Spurs in their sets. Everybody's in the right place when he's on the floor. But Patty Mills is in the NBA because he's a top-notch culture guy, because he's the guy who can talk to the players, not as a coach, but get the message across. He's the guy who's seen things and can relate. He's the guy who shows up early, those kind of things. Yogi Ferrell's that guy. I mean, Yogi Ferrell is the player coach. He's the guy who sets the example. I think he's got a good chance of sticking around because of that. I do think Sacramento's a good spot for him, where I would try and I would hope that the Kings would pick up my option if I were him. But it's going to be interesting to see. I think he's a guy who he wouldn't get a multi-year deal in free agency right now, but I could see him getting a 1-year deal a bunch of different places. And as for Vonleh, I mean, I watched a lot of him this season in New York. Just, the Knicks were unwatchable, but when Noah Vonleh was playing, it was just enough to get me to tune in. And he'd have nights where he'd have the Knicks beat writers really excited. Like, have the Knicks found something here? Like, what's going on? Why doesn't anyone else have this guy? And then he'd have like 3 or 4 forgettable nights where you're like, oh, I understand why he's here now. But I mean, Vonleh has the size that Morgan and Bryant don't have. He's a big guy, and he's a great rebounder. That is definitely his elite skill. He averaged almost 8 a game this year. There's plenty of bricks in Knicks games, but there's not, exceptionally more than any other team. So I think that Vonleh's kind of established himself as an NBA player at this point, but he's in that same weird gray area where he's not a franchise player. Nobody's going to build around him. He's still going to have to prove himself year to year.
The crazy thing about Vonleh too is, and I think he's only 23, right?
So young. Yeah. He's so young still. Yeah.
Yeah, which is amazing. Let's talk about the two guys that are still in the playoffs. At least their teams are still in the playoffs. Eric Gordon for Houston, who's still going strong, and then we'll get to OG Anunoby as well, whose team is in the playoffs, but he's not playing. Let's start with Gordon. Kind of had a slow start, but it seems like he really picked things up late, and they're obviously positioned maybe as well as anybody to win the title right now.
Absolutely, and I mean the craziest thing to me about Eric Gordon, I'm double checking now, is that he's 30 years old now, and it makes me feel old to be like, oh my God, I can't believe he's a established veteran in the NBA at this point. And he didn't quite become an all-star like we thought he might be when he was with the Clippers early in his career, but he's done a great job of kind of reinventing himself as a third guard, and Houston is the perfect place for him. I'm guessing he would love to finish his career there, especially when he played with James Harden and Chris Paul. A lot of pressure is taken off. You're gonna have a lot of attention on the other side of the court if you're playing with one of them. But also, Mike D'Antoni's system is perfect for him. Gordon has a permanent green light when he's on the floor. He doesn't have to worry about sharing touches. The Rockets are actually pretty thin when it comes to guys who can create their own shots. So if Harden or Chris Paul aren't on the floor, they need Gordon to shoot 10 times, 15 times a game. And that's what he does best. If Gordon isn't shooting 15 times a game for you, it doesn't make sense for him to be on the floor. But he can really score. And there's also, Houston has had plenty of injuries this year. Harden and Chris Paul have both missed time. He's slid in as the point guard or the shooting guard and done exceptionally well for them. And Houston is built around their playmakers. They've got the role players and the big man in Clint Capella, where Gordon can go ham. He can do whatever he wants out there. He can shoot from 30 feet. He can take it to the hoop. No one's going to stop him. He shot the ball pretty well this year. I think he averaged like 16 a game. He's in the perfect spot for him, and I think he's under contract one more year there. So it's nice to see a guy find his perfect role in the NBA, and Eric Gordon's absolutely in there right now.
And as for OG, he's had kind of a rough season. I think his dad passed away. He had the appendectomy recently. What are we to make of his progression here as a second-year player? I mean, and did he progress as a second-year player?
Yeah. I disappointed to say it, but I do think he regressed, unfortunately. And it kind of just shows you how insanely competitive the NBA is, because, SI.com was included. We were raving about OG last year. I mean, the narrative was, how did all these other teams miss this guy? Like, this is just in one of those another situations where a good NBA team finds a good player and all the bad ones continue to struggle. The narrative has changed drastically this year. I mean, he's kind of become the forgotten man a little bit in Toronto. You've seen one of his teammates, Pascal Siakam, come out of nowhere to be this franchise player all of a sudden. And that was kind of the spot that OG was going for last year, where it was like, well, OG's going to be their franchise guy. And then when they traded for Kawhi Leonard, it was like, well, that's good to hear, but what about OG? Well, that seems like a crazy narrative now. The Raptors are definitely hoping to keep Kawhi Leonard. Not a sure thing. A lot of people almost assume he's going to go to LA no matter what happens. So if Kawhi Leonard were to leave, that would change the situation drastically for OG in Toronto. He's great insurance, from Masai Ujiri to have. But if Kawhi Leonard stays, I'm not sure where he fits in. Danny Green is a really good player. He's undervalued. He took all of OG's minutes this year, and he played very well. And then they've got another guy, Norm Powell, who is super inconsistent, but has shown flashes. And the thing that we needed OG to do this year was become a better three-point shooter, and he became worse. I think he was 37% as a rookie. He's down to 33% this year. That is not the trend you want to see. OG is not a guy who's going to lead your team in scoring unless you lose by 50. But he needs to be contributing 10 or 12 points a night to be respectable out there too. So it was a disappointing year for him. He definitely had not excuses, reasons for a disappointing season. But it also reminds you that even if you were a lottery pick or something, you've got to play well because there's so many guys who could take your job.
Matt, everyone obviously aware of Victor Oladipo's situation. I don't want to get much into him as a player. I'm more curious for your thoughts as someone who follows the Pacers closely. The long-term plan for them, obviously they have Oladipo, I think, under contract for at least a couple more years. They have Sabonis, they have Miles Turner. For them to actually move up the pecking order in the East, what's going to have to happen? Because I feel like this year they kind of did some Band-Aid things like Tyreek Evans and maybe some, I don't know who else they signed this offseason, but they made some moves. That Doug McDermott was the other one. Those aren't really going to move the needle when you're going up against teams like Philadelphia, Boston, Toronto, Milwaukee. Right now, I don't think anyone could objectively look at the Pacers and say they're anything better than the fifth team in the East going forward. What can they do with their team to kind of move up, and where do you think they can actually be one of those elite teams if Victor is their best player?
I think they can. I do think that they probably have maybe the most difficult offseason of anybody in the NBA. And, they're not going for Kevin Durant. They're not trying to lure Kawhi Leonard. So it's not going to get a lot of attention. But in terms of sheer tough decisions to make, the Pacers face the most. And I think it is a dream GM situation to have this type of flexibility, to have this many options, to have this many tough decisions to make. But Kevin Pritchard's probably not going to sleep a lot this summer. The biggest decision he has to make is, can Miles Turner and Domantas Sabonis play together long term? And personally, someone who watches the Pacers a lot, I don't think they can. And I'm not sure which guy is the one to keep. Miles Turner led the league in blocks. He projects as a great, center in 2019, 2020, those types of, where the modern game is. But man, I think Sabonis is the better player a lot of nights. The way he's, so versatile, he can rebound so well. He's so crafty around the hoop. I'm not sure which guy the Pacers are going to commit to there, but I'm not sure long term they can commit to both. And that kind of leads into every one of their other decisions because, the big thing that the Pacers have lacked for honestly, as long as I've been alive, is a point guard. And Darren Collison is, a perfect point guard as an average point guard in the NBA. He's probably the 25th best point guard in the NBA. He is not going to lose any games for you. He's not going to win many games for you. He is perfectly fine. Perfectly fine is not good enough. If you look at the other teams, most of them have an elite ball handler. Victor Oladipo is that, but he can also play pretty well off the ball. I think the Pacers have to try and upgrade a point guard, and maybe that does involve parlaying Sabonis or Turner into one. Maybe it's clearing cap room and finding somebody. The Pacers have so many difficult decisions to make. Those are just the start of them. They've got so many free agents. They have to decide, is Bojan Bogdanovic a franchise player? He sure as hell looked like it some nights this year, and he fit well against Oladipo. And I think the Pacers, more than any team in the East, had the best chemistry, and those guys really played well together. Nate McMillan made all the pieces fit together. It's a tough decision to make whether you run it back and try and keep that cohesion, or if you try and make a monumental upgrade because you realize being the fourth best team in the East doesn't mean a lot. So it's really going to be a fascinating summer to see what they do. The Pacers have generally been a pretty conservative team. They don't do wacky trades when they have in the past. It has actually come back to hurt them. But it's interesting too, because, so many teams like the Knicks, the Clippers, they get all this attention, free agency. It's make or break for them. If they get LeBron or KD or Kawhi Leonard, they win. If they don't, they lose. The Pacers situation is much more intricate, where we won't know for several years whether they really won or lost. But as for Oladipo, I'm sure this is a universally agreed opinion. If there's anyone who's going to come back from an injury like that, I'll bet on that guy. So I don't think they're wavering in any way on that.
We've been talking for a while now, and we still haven't hit all the IU players in the NBA, which is nice. There were, for a while there, these conversations would go pretty quickly, but now we've got some guys. We still haven't talked about Cody Zeller yet, who, after really struggling last year, only played 33 games, dealing with injuries. Really this year, it felt like got back to the progression that we had seen 2 years ago. Second most points he's averaged. The rebounding was back up. But again, it was another, injury-plagued season where he only got to play 49 games. What's the future for Cody?
It does feel like Cody's trajectory has changed a little bit from, in college when he was one of the best players in the nation, no question, to like now where it's like, he projects as a long-term role player. And I think that is probably the situation. I think, the contract he's on right now is a great contract, and he's signed through 2021. He's going to build a hell of a house in Washington, Indiana one day, and I can't wait to see all of his tweets about it. But, I think Cody's probably best served on a different team as the first big man off the bench. I don't think he's quick enough and not a good enough shooter to be a starter on a playoff team. But I think he can give you 25 solid minutes, and if someone gets injured, there wouldn't be a huge drop off. You'd feel good about having Cody in the game. And he still does enough where, I don't think it's like the Hornets are giving up on him or anything. I still think that he's very talented, and he's only 26-ish right now. So, but I don't know. The Hornets are kind of a weird place to be. They're spunky every year, but they don't really matter. And it's going to be night or day of whether Kemba Walker stays or not. If Kemba Walker stays, Cody will continue to probably put up these solidish numbers and try and stay healthy. If Kemba leaves, though, the Hornets will do a complete rebuild, and that probably won't include Cody Zeller. A player at 26 years old is probably too old for a rebuild at this point. So you could see him moved, which might be for the best for his career, but it is nice to see him get regular playing time when he is healthy. And there was a logjam down there for a long time. It still kind of is, but with Dwight Howard being gone, I think it makes things a little easier. Frank Kaminsky is another guy who kind of had an up or down year, where the Hornets probably aren't in love with what they're seeing there either. So I don't know. The Hornets are probably going to go through something big this summer. If I'm Kemba Walker, as much as I feel loyalty to them, I'd probably move on. So Kemba's decision will probably impact Cody's future.
And the only other guy I think that we haven't mentioned that got some NBA run this year was Troy Williams. And, he's, every season he's kind of played, 21 games here, 17 games there. And he's done some of what he did in college, which is be a really good finisher, a high 2-point field goal percentage, but he's only shooting 29.9% from 3-point range, which to the point that you were making earlier, that's I would say a big reason why he hasn't been able to stick, because a guy of his height, you're going to have to be able to make threes to stay in there.
It's everything. It'll be interesting to see who has a better pro career, Troy Williams or Juwan Morgan. Because if you were going to ask IU fans, who would have a better career, or maybe selfishly, who they would root for, 99% would say Juwan Morgan. Troy Williams had some moments at IU, but he didn't have the same bond with Hoosier fans, I think. But if I were to put my money on it, I would put it on Troy Williams, honestly, because I do think he still projects better. He does have a slightly better skill set in the NBA. And, we saw Juwan. I think he did very well at the Portsmouth Invitational last week. And that's like the level of competition that I think he's going to continue to thrive against. The players who are not quite good enough for the NBA, he's very good against. With Troy Williams, there's no chance he won't be the fifth best player on the floor for his team. I mean, that is going to be his role as a 3-and-D type guy. Well, he's shown the D, he's shown the rebounding. The threes aren't there. Even in the G League, he shot 30% from 3-point range this year. That's just not going to cut it. He's going to be in the G League again next year if he's shooting the same, most likely. So it is funny. I think like 15 years ago, if we had this conversation, maybe it comes down to how can he do one-on-one? Can he create his own shot in isolation? Then I would have favored Juwan Morgan, no question. Juwan Morgan's way better as a half-court player. But that's not really where things are right now. So you got to favor a guy like Troy Williams, and maybe it changes. Maybe it goes back in 5 years to where we do value those individual scorers more. But for right now, I would think Troy is a better shot than Juwan in the NBA.
Matt, with the guys who are kind of on the fringe, I mean, DJ White kind of went through this same situation. At what point as a player do you give up the NBA dream and do you go overseas? Because I'm sure overseas, Troy Williams could make a couple $100,000 easily and not have to worry about going back and forth between an NBA and a G League team. Same thing could be true for Juwan Morgan. What in your mind? What's the breaking point to where you kind of realize, hey, this isn't going to work. I need to go somewhere else.
Well, in my infinite wisdom as a 32-year-old man now who has a 9-month-old baby, I can tell you priorities change as you grow older. And, you see a guy like Jordan Hulls, I'll go back to him. He's got a family. The Hulls probably aren't hard up for money, but he's got a family he's got to support, and it seems like he's not only making money in Germany or in Europe, but he's playing very competitive basketball and he's playing a critical role on those teams. And that is probably more rewarding than trying to grind it out in the G League. First of all, in the G League, you're making next to nothing. You're taking the worst buses you can imagine to games. You've got the worst road trips. You basically need to win the lottery to get called up. And it's probably not going to happen. Now, if it's your dream, you're going to continue to chase it. If it's kind of your dream, you might consider your other options. And that's why I do think guys like Jeff Newton, Jordan Hulls, we're smart to go overseas because you can have a great basketball career. You can see the world and you can support your family. So, I mean, if I was a guy like Juwan Morgan right now, I would absolutely try and make it to the NBA, and you would be crazy not to do everything within your power to try and make that happen. But would I mind playing professional basketball in Italy for a couple of years? No, that sounds pretty good to me. So, it just comes down to these guys' priorities. And, guys like Christian Watford, there's a bunch of them. It's tough to make that decision. It's got to be the toughest decision to make of whether you pursue your dream or whether you settle. And, I don't blame a lot of guys for not wanting to settle, but at a certain point, it's tough not to see the writing on the wall. So these are the kind of things where it's good to have an agent and it's good to have this NBA process to bring it back full circle where you can find out as early as possible, is this going to be a thing or not? Because if you can know at 20 years old, I might not make the NBA despite everything at this point leading up to it, you consider your other options and you have a better appreciation for them. But if you've just been told your whole life that you're the man, those guys don't even know. Those guys are at the mock drafts. They're idiots. People just need to see what I can do. You're going to be at a disservice to yourself. So it's good to get all this information out there and the guys who are fringe players, just to know the situation as much as possible.
Glad you mentioned Jeff Newton, the Michael Jordan of Japan, which is one of the great stories of Indiana players in the pros that maybe not everybody knows about. But that's a good professional career,
I would love to be one of the best basketball players in the history of Japan. That's an amazing thing to say. So, you see it with the WNBA too. They have the same decision as these G League guys. Honestly, do you stay in America and you try and make the WNBA a thing and become mainstream, or do you go over to Russia and earn 4 times as much money and play in front of people who actually care about women's basketball, and treat it like it's the biggest sport in the world? I mean, these are tough decisions to make.
Yeah. So last question for you. Obviously, we feel pretty good that we'll be talking about Romeo in this conversation next year. We hope that we'll be talking about Juwan Morgan. Now, as you look at the Indiana roster and the guys that are left, the guys who are coming in, there's not really an obvious next NBA guy, even though Indiana's enrolling another, McDonald's All-American and Trace Jackson Davis.
True.
Who are you most confident in on the guys left on the roster that will be the next guy that we're talking about as a Hoosier player in the NBA? Well, if you had to pick one.
Yeah, despite my earlier slander, I do believe it's Justin Smith. I just think in terms of flashes I've seen and measurables, it seems like he has the best chance. I do not know enough about him as a person or really even a player at this point to say confidently one way or the other. But, Devontae Green, he's too small and a little too overconfident in shot selection sometimes. I don't see him happening. Al Durham is a guy who, as a Hoosier fan, I really like and would love to see that type of progression. But, I mean, even a guy like Victor Oladipo, you never saw that kind of leap coming. Even if you were an Oladipo fan, year to year at IU, the way he improved in the offseason, it was mind-boggling. It blew your mind to see how much better he was the next season. There are guys on IU's roster who could absolutely do that, improve people like me wrong, and take those leaps. But I
guess the difference is Oladipo had that athleticism to start from, and
totally.
And that's a little different. There's no one really who projects with that kind of athleticism on the current roster.
And the more you get to know Victor Oladipo, the more it makes sense that he's the kind of guy who put in the work to make it happen. Like that, that does make sense now. I don't know. What do you guys think? I think Justin Smith has the raw tools. I just don't know if he can figure out the know-how. What do you think?
I mean, Justin Smith, who played against Michigan State, that's an NBA player. The problem is, those flashes were few and far between. And as we've talked about on this show and others, there are plenty of examples of guys getting it as upperclassmen. Daryl Thomas and, of course, the story of Landon Turner. Like, some guys take a little while to get it, and he does have the natural ability. So if the light can flip on for him as an upperclassman, it's certainly possible. It's just the weight of the evidence of his playing career right now is kind of hard to overlook when it comes to that. So hopefully he proves everybody wrong.
And I don't know enough about Archie Miller yet to say if he's the kind of guy who can take a player like that and take him to the next level. I mean, could Tom Crean handle the end of a game and a timeout sometimes? No. So there were plenty of situations where we were like, this guy doesn't know what he's doing. But look at the way he grew prospects. Look at the way he helped them reach the NBA and achieve their dreams and be in a position to succeed. I mean, there's a lot of guys that he set up for success, and that's why he kept getting recruits. That's why he's going to get recruits in Georgia. So it'll be interesting to see what type of talent projector Archie Miller is. And, after seeing Romeo Langford this season, he's going to face an uphill battle in recruiting now. There's going to be a lot of recruits who point to Romeo and say, yeah, but what about him? What happened there? So, it'll be interesting to see how things go. I need to know more about Trace Jackson Davis. I know so little at this point. I can't wait to watch him play, though.
If he can shoot, he's got the athleticism, good passer, seems to have a great mindset. I think that'll be the big skill for him, and it's maybe one of the bigger swing skills for Indiana basketball over the next 2 or 3 years is can Trace shoot? Because if he develops that shot, he's going to be a really dynamic player. So
he's got an NBA pedigree too, so don't forget that.
That's where I was going to say, as a longtime Dale Davis fan, let me tell you, let's hope his dad is not the one teaching him how to shoot, because Dale Davis might have worse form than I do.
All right. Well, Matt, thank you. Always a pleasure to have you on Podcast on the Brink, and we'll look forward to doing this again next year. And hopefully, we have a surprise name or two that we can add to the conversation.
It won't be Greg Rosenstein, probably. It probably won't be him.
No, definitely won't be him.
Thanks, guys.
Thanks, Matt.
Appreciate it.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Podcast on the Brink. We always appreciate you being here. Remember to join me and my co-hosts for more IU basketball talk at assemblycall.com, and visit Alex over at insidethehall.com for complete coverage of Indiana basketball. If you want to support Podcast on the Brink, here is the single best way to do it. Tell anyone you know who loves IU hoops about us and suggest that they subscribe. Podcast on the Brink can be found on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, and everywhere else podcasts are available. Tell your social media followers, email your friends, text your family members. For weekly discussion about IU basketball, they need to be subscribed to Podcast on the Brink. We'll talk to you next time. Go Hoosiers.